Yeah, so, if you haven't watched the introduction to today's sermon on the church at Pergamos, Revelation chapter 2, verses 12 to 17, I'd encourage you to do that, where we started off from verse 12 and we spoke about Jesus being introduced with the one with the two-edged sword. And today's sermon is really following on from that introduction. And it really is a message to highlight the dangers of compromise. And this is what the church at Pergamos was noted for and received the rebuke from Jesus. So when we look at verse 13, we find that it is referred to as where Satan's throne is. So Pergamum or Pergamos was situated right at where Satan's throne was. So it was the hub of evil. And we know that history tells us that it was a central place of Caesar worship and the Greek god Zeus. So it was really a pagan capital. And as Jesus describes it as the place where Satan's throne was. So it was really at the, where they would say the rubber met the road in terms of evil. That's where Pergamos was. And interestingly as well is that it was a center of education. It was noted for having a very well-known and a large university, institutions of education, higher learning, and a large library as well. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not against academics and the pursuit of higher education, but we find that there's a common theme here, that Jesus describes it as the place where Satan's throne is, center of the worship of Caesar and Zeus, and then education as well. Because we find that today, whether you know it or not, there are a lot of academics that get so swollen-headed with their knowledge and their IQ that it pushes them away from God, because that's what Satan is. Satan is one of the first, in fact, he is the first narcissist of the world. And we find that with the accumulation of knowledge and wisdom, if it's not tempered with a relationship with Jesus Christ and humility in Christ, then it leads to where evil can rule and reign. And that's where Paul had those challenges against the philosophers at Mars Hill and the people that elevated earthly knowledge and wisdom above the Bible. So with all of that going against them, being where Satan's throne was, the church at Pergamos was commended by Jesus that yet, in spite of all of these distractions and evil, you hold fast to my name and you did not deny my faith. So much so that the first pastor of Pergamos, Antipas, he was so loyal and dedicated to Christ that he was burned for not worshiping Caesar. That is where he was commended by Jesus, as we read in verse 13 onwards, that he was a martyr, one who gave his life for Christ. So this is just the backdrop of where Pergamos is. So despite everything that was happening around it that was contrary to the gospel and to the works of Jesus Christ, they were commended for holding fast and not denying their faith. And when we look at the rebuke comes in verse 14. But I have a few things against you, because you have there those who hold the doctrine of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the children of Israel, to eat things sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality. So we find here that the church at Pergamos now was like the false prophet of Balaam, who misled the children of Israel to follow off after the idols, idolatry, and the false teachings, because really Balaam was a false prophet. And if you look at the history in terms of Balaam, he was really a prophet for hire, and he was paid to curse Israel. And when he couldn't, what he then decided to do was to say to the king, well, let's send the Moabite woman amongst the Israelites, that they would be then mixed and turned and misled into immorality. And we find that in Numbers 25 verse 1, it says that they were sacrificed to their gods and they ate and bowed to them. So that's what the teachings of Balaam, and that's what Jesus is referring to here. That Pergamos now, like the children of Israel, had gone after the false teachings and the false influence of the false prophet Balaam. So we find as well that Israel at the time was destroyed from the inside by the seduction of the Moabites, the heathen and the ungodly. So Jesus here is warning Pergamon that similarly to the false prophets, they are in their midst as well. So the false prophets of Balaam, that false teaching, that heresy, that evil now is amongst them, and they are being embracing of the pagan and the ungodly practices. So what Jesus is saying to Pergamum is that, he's rebuking them because they have not pushed that out. They have actually tolerated the sin, and they haven't dealt with those that are sinning and being polluted. So that is the big no that Jesus had against them, the big cross that he had against them. Because we find that this is what led to Pergamos from gaining infamy and being known as the compromising church. Because as we said, it was the worshiping center of Caesar, and they were now embracing the world. They were bringing all of the worldliness and all of the wrong teaching and tolerating it in the church. So worshiping Caesar, and which was significant of the world and the flesh, meant that you could worship others. So at that time, if you worship Caesar, then there's no problem. You could go to church, you could do your thing as well. But the true Christians did not. Like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they refused to bow. Like Daniel, they refused to bow. And this is where you find the wrong teaching came in. Well, if we could worship Caesar, then we could go to church as well. But this is where we serve God alone. You shall have no other idols before you, no other gods before you, because I am a jealous God, says God. So Pergamos, if we had to look at it, equals to and is any church and any believer that is in the world, that says that they're Christian, but they're in the world. Coming from Africa, I would meet a lot of locals, and they would be in the church and they would say that they're Christians, but they would still have ancestral artifacts or trinkets, animal skins, and I would ask them, well, what is that? And they go, oh, well, this is to honor my ancestors. And we find similarly, when I look at people that have come out of Hinduism, my religion of my birth, and even though they say they were Christian, but they would still be practicing some of the belief structures of the previous faith that they were in. And if I had to liken that to Pergamos, this is what Jesus is saying, that they were now still holding on to the things of the past and the things of the world. So Jesus' rebuke and his issue was not with the non-Christians, but with the Christians that were practicing immorality and idolatry within the church. And the church leaders were not doing anything to rebuke that, to be able to say to them, let's get rid of it. But they had embraced it. And this is where he refers to Balaam, because the teaching of Balaam was now prominent in them. And today's church becomes like Pergamos. Today's church, today's Christian becomes like Pergamos when it embraces the world. And there's an old saying that if it looks like something, if it acts like something, and if it quacks, then what is it? It is a duck. That's correct. It is a duck. So you find that God has not called us to look and to act and to sound like the world. He wants us to be what he has asked us to be, followers of Jesus Christ, disciples of Jesus Christ. As much as I've got a picture of a duck up there, I think the picture of an animal that aptly describes the state of Pergamos and where Pergamos was in terms of its compromise is this here, which we all know is a chameleon. And the thing with the chameleon is that a chameleon takes its color from its surrounding and it blends in, it camouflages itself into the world. But God has not called us to be like a chameleon, to take our color from the world. God has called us to be not conformed to the world, as Paul said in Romans 12:2, but he's called us to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, holding fast to his word, and not to take color from our environment, but to put color in our environment. not to blend in and to be like our environment, but to stand out, to be the head and not the tail, to be above and not below.